Hello, and welcome to another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. My name is Andrej Matišak, and I work as the Deputy Head of Foreign Desk in Slovak Daily Pravda, which, by the way, means truth, and it's not Russian Pravda.
If authoritarians seek to dictate the global agenda, while liberal democracies at least partly resist, could this lead to conflicts, or even wars? This was one of my questions for Alexander Cooley, Professor of Political Science at Barnard College, Columbia University, and Alexander Dukauskis, Associate Professor in the School of Politics and International Relations at University College Dublin. Their new book, Dictating the Agenda, The Authoritarian Resurgence in World Politics, examines how authoritarian powers have grown more confident and assertive in challenging liberal norms. In our conversation, with Professor Cooley speaking first, we discuss what triggered this authoritarian resurgence, why today's autocrats are no longer ashamed of their systems, and what role the West itself played in enabling this global shift. Listen to our conversation.
If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Coffee. For the link, see also a description of this episode. And now, up to the new debate.
The title of your book is Dictating the Agenda, The Authoritarian Resurgence in World Politics. Can you, in a few sentences, introduce your book to our listeners and readers? And please also tell us what triggered you to write it.
I think in some ways this book takes stock of what has been noticed, but perhaps not comprehensively explained over the last 15 years, which is the real backsliding of democratic values and democratic principles and what we call liberal principles across global politics as an established norm of ordering and structuring politics. And so really this is a book about the fate of two such processes that I think we just assumed would be dominant in global governance: liberal soft power, or this idea that liberal democracies should be emulated, right? That they were the best ways of organizing political and economic life, and liberal advocacy, the idea that different groups, civil society with transnational networks, would campaign to spotlight human rights abuses, political inequality, that would take the causes of expanding rights and protecting rights all the way through the UN system and advocate for new treaties and enforcement of treaties. And so political liberalism as a set of practices, values, norms, institutions has been dramatically eroded, especially over the last 15 years. The source of that erosion is the rise of authoritarian powers, China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, geopolitically, but also shifts in global markets and consumer markets. While it used to be that liberal democratic countries also had the biggest consumer bases in the world, now we see places like China and Saudi Arabia with real investment power and consumer power. And so we wanted to put these stories together to talk about the contestation now of ideas and the fact that the authoritarianism that we have now, it's not a kind of defensive Cold War era authoritarianism. It's an aggressive, forward-looking authoritarianism that's less ashamed. It's quite happy to be out there in the public sphere, to be emulated, to experiment, and to openly challenge liberal ideas, values, and principles. So that was the motivation. And also, we also wanted to look at some areas that perhaps don't normally receive a lot of attention when we talk about democracy and authoritarianism. So we talk justifiably a lot about human rights or democracy promotion, but we wanted to look at areas like global media, global sport, global consumer campaigns, where we've also seen real significant changes in the last 15 years in ways that perhaps aren't appreciated by foreign policy analysts, at least.
Alex, you want to add anything?
No, I think Alex did a great job describing the contours of the book, for sure.
Yep. So how much are you looking also at the theory that the rise of authoritarianism is, first of all, the fault of the West, which became too cocky, especially after the Cold War, which led to the Iraq War and the global financial crisis, and recently to what many observers call the double standards regarding the Gaza war. And also that this often mentioned rule-based liberal order is more or less a myth, and was always constructed for the benefit of the West, especially the US.
Yeah, I think we do wrestle with some of the limitations of the Western model of promoting liberal democracy. So in the 1990s, this was kind of the height of that way of thinking. And we argue that it rested on a few assumptions. One assumption was that the West, and the United States in particular, was like effective, that it was good at what it did. I mean, as Alex said, that this is the best way to organize political and social life. That was kind of an assumption at the time. Another assumption was that the West would have kind of continue to have disproportionate consumer and economic and market power. And the third is that NGOs and activists and universities could operate with political autonomy and political independence to promote their viewpoints. And those kinds of assumptions all had weaknesses that I think at the time people didn't necessarily reflect on or understand or appreciate. If you look at analysis in the 1990s about threats to liberal democracy globally, it was Islam, global Islam. It was kind of processes of globalization erasing culture and erasing particularity and an anxiety about kind of the homogenizing effect of globalization. There were very few, if any, people really taking seriously the idea that powerful authoritarian states could rise and challenge the so-called liberal international order. At that time, authoritarian states basically had to pretend to be democracies. They had elections, or they welcomed election observers or pro-democracy organizations to do work. That was kind of a simulation. Nowadays, they don't even really need to pretend anymore. That they're much more unapologetically married to their own systems, and in some ways even promoting their own systems abroad. So I think there were some missteps, of course, by the West, but in my view, and maybe my co-author disagrees, I think it goes too far to say it's completely the fault of the West. I mean, I think authoritarian states or non-Western states have agency, and they learned over time that this globalization thing that was emerging, while initially it seemed very threatening to authoritarian power, they learned over time that they could manage it and not only survive, but increasingly thrive.
Yeah, and certainly I would agree with all that. And I would say probably there were three defining geopolitical events that also served as kind of weakeners of the model, right? The first was the aftermath of 9/11, when the U.S. not only led a coalition in Afghanistan to topple the Taliban and nation build there, but it also led to this creation of new categories of actors who would be pursued outside the criminal system. The kind of channels for dealing with terrorism, for blacklisting them, for denying them constitutional rights or other defendants, right? And this was not just in the U.S., places like Guantanamo Bay, but all around the world. We created new kinds of processes for dealing with terrorists and extremists, and that has had a long shelf life. Also, the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009, I think undermined the legitimacy of the liberal democratic economic model of international finance, and the U.S. was at the heart of that. And then I would say democracy itself and the democracy promotion agenda was also undermined in 2003 by the Iraq War. The idea that this was being done to liberate Iraq, create a democracy there too, the sort of democracy under the barrel of the gun paradigm didn't work out. So certainly these were important inflection points, and they diminished Western credibility on these issues. But I think Alex's point about some just like the inevitable rise and the learning that's taken place by countries like China, Russia, and Saudi Arabia is also really important.
I think that we can say that the core theory of your book is authoritarian snapback, where autocracies are trying to reshape liberal institutions to dictate an illiberal agenda. But how much is this a coordinated effort? Do authoritarian states, and just to name few, China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, but for example also small country like United Arab Emirates, really collaborate beyond purely following self-interest?
So sometimes they do. but a lot of it is about emulation. What we see now is that the prominent role of authoritarian states in, for example, investing in their own forms of global media or their own types of soft power or hosting Western sporting events or branch campuses of Western universities, that this confidence that they have, that it's okay to do this and to just be yourself, you don't have to pretend to be a democracy, that gives confidence to the others. Yeah. So I think it's more about confidence and emulation than actual coordination. There is some coordination, right? The UN Human Rights Council, for instance, they're sort of pushing back against a program, right? The Chinese will demand cooperation, for example, when they're being sort of reviewed or scrutinized, or they conduct votes, for example, on the Xinjiang, re-education camps. So there is some of that goes on in international institutions, but I think the greater effect that we see is that authoritarians now are very comfortable being themselves, promoting their nation, their social and political values in a way that might be antithetical or, in their view, sort of beyond sort of liberalism, that they don't have to hide it anymore. And that confidence, I think, allows many of their authoritarian peers to do the same.
I think Alex is right. There's a mixture. I mean, there are some instances of direct cooperation. So the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, for example, has a system to register and extradite one another's activists or one another's dissidents, basically. So that's a very formal kind of cooperation to confront perceived threats. But I think the learning and emulation is really important. I mean, there's some instances that other researchers, not us, have uncovered of legislation to ban or to limit the activities of non-government organizations, NGOs. I mean, literally being copy and pasted from one jurisdiction to another, sometimes forgetting to change the country name, So they look around and they see kind of what works and emulate what works. Sometimes that's through direct coordination. China and Russia are increasingly coordinating their propaganda efforts, for example, and learning from one another. I think there's a more institutional cooperation kind of gradually emerging in that relationship. But very often it's informal and based on learning, looking, watching what works.
But let's talk a bit maybe also about this more formal cooperation. The Russian large-scale invasion of Ukraine seemed at first to unite liberal democracies. Yet over time, authoritarian actors have adapted. Russia is openly supported by Iran and North Korea, and at least partly by China. Does the Ukraine war demonstrate a limit of liberal international, let's say, solidarity? While the support for Ukraine continues, Russian dictator and wanted war criminal Vladimir Putin also got the red carpet treatment at the Alaska summit. So how we should look at this?
I think your question points to the fact that we've gone through sort of multiple stages and moments of the significance of the Ukraine war more broadly. When the war was first started with the nominal ideas that it was a limited special military operation meant to demilitarize, denazify Ukraine, you saw this, as you mentioned, this tremendous mobilization of the liberal democratic West, like what we would call a liberal democratic set of allies, right? On sanctions, on accepting Ukrainian refugees, on providing weapons of escalating sophistication to Ukraine. And we saw, I think, also importantly, real opprobrium by the corporate sector. All of these Western companies sort of pulling out because of the reputational risk, because this had just seemed so over the top, so extreme that they couldn't be associated with that. Then an interesting thing happened. The Russians started messaging less that this was about fighting Nazis, and they pivoted to a set of messages that this was really about combating, yes, the liberal democratic order. If you look at Putin's annexation speeches, which are actually quite interesting, even though they are propaganda, the imagery that he uses is, the colonial West. They want us as slaves. They want the dollar and technological dominance. They engage in not just double standards, triple standards in terms of sort of like hypocrisy. There's actually a section of the annexation speech of those 4 Ukrainian provinces, September 2022, that talks about the problems of gender reassignment surgery that the West wants to transmit. And so it becomes this amalgam of just kind of grievances with all of these stylized sort of like liberal democratic values and things. And Ukraine becomes a place where you can pin onto this conflict the things that you don't like about the global system. That's proven to be pretty effective in places like the Middle East and Latin America and South Asia in terms of sort of the messaging of what this is about. At the same time, I think Europe has been slow to understand that while maybe the Russians thought at the beginning that this was about sort of the European security architecture and we need some sort of change in that. Really, the conversation now, because of the involvement of North Korea and Iran and China in systematic re-export, is more about like, are Russia's sort of European partners going to change really the geopolitics of what this supposed European conflict is about? Is this about the Eurasianization of Europe's borderlands itself? So it's all in flux, but I think different sides have wanted to project onto this what they wanted to do. I'll make one more core observation about this. I think it's very understandable that Ukraine wanted to frame this as a battle between an aggressive authoritarian Russia and a democratic, civic-minded Ukraine. And certainly the level of civil society, the solidarity, the mobilization, the ethos have been extraordinary in Ukraine, as well as the international campaigns. I think strategically, it's been a mistake in terms of appealing to potential partners in the global South. I think Ukraine would have been better off emphasizing the sovereignty issue than the democracy issue, because sovereignty is much more important to the global South countries than democracy is for some of the reasons that we've talked about in the book.
Yeah, I just want to add on to that on the other side of the equation of, thinking about China's role in all of this, because I think it's been interesting. I mean, the North Korea and Iran partners have very explicitly aided Russia, and China has been trying to play a sort of double or triple game even by maintaining neutrality officially, proposing a peace plan, if you recall, early on in the conflict, in which the first plank of the peace plan was territorial integrity has to be valued, to which immediately everybody asked, well, whose territorial integrity? And so immediately the peace plan kind of ran into rocky shores. Officially neutral, but telling its domestic audience effectively that Russia's right, that we're on Russia's side. And over the summer, reportedly, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi telling Kaja Kallas of the European Union that actually China wants Russia to win the war because of the fear that if Russia loses, then the United States and the West would then focus more intentionally on China. Interestingly enough, this is the messaging that Chinese interlocutors have been telling their Russian counterparts the entire time. That's the viewpoint. So it is interesting that China has felt compelled to have this political neutrality globally, when really I think we all kind of know it's not entirely neutral. One thing that I would add that's kind of, I'm sure, is happening now is in terms of the authoritarian learning, you can be absolutely sure that lots of Chinese think tanks and policymakers and analysts are studying the effect and how to circumvent sanctions, what the global reaction was to Russia's invasion of Ukraine for its own potential conflict down the line with Taiwan. You can be absolutely sure that they learned a lot from this period of what to do, what to avoid, should that eventuality ever occur.
How much is the idea of soft power important for authoritarian countries? Because you mentioned that, and of course, we see that they are really trying to use the various tools. And by the way, for example, there is in Saudi Arabia, there is a comedy festival. There are American comedians there, and there is a discussion about it, if they should be there. Chinese animations. So is the soft power important for authoritarians?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a pretty stark irony in going to a comedy festival in Saudi Arabia and complaining that you're censored in the United States for your comedy. Of course, many people pointed out that contradiction. Yeah, so soft power, is one of these concepts that is kind of diffuse and means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But I think the way many authoritarian states understand it is as a state-driven project, that it's not associated with kind of independent civil society. And so they do these things like host these big events in order to bolster their image, present themselves as kind of normal players in a global stage. Hey, we can have a comedy festival, or I think they're big on like WWE wrestling, these kinds of events. If you think that's normal, I don't know. And so I think they want to show that they're normal. And what we saw in the book in particular is an effort to do this in the sports world, particularly focused on Saudi Arabia, but not only, but Saudi Arabia is a major player here. People think of holding these big events as kind of a distraction from human rights abuses, and that's part of the story. But I think what we realized is that a much bigger part of the story is that underneath that big event, there's all kinds of investments and financial tie-ups between the authoritarian, in this case, Saudi's public investment fund, between the authoritarian state and the athletes and clubs and organizations that governing organizations of sports. All these financial tie-ups that give incentives for partners and other actors abroad to not criticize the host, basically. And in some cases, even there are explicit non-disparagement clauses put into some of these agreements so that athletes or others can't criticize Saudi Arabia or else they face sanction. And so the kind of circuses aspect to it is very interesting, but underneath all of that, there's a whole realm of financial tie-ups that change the incentives of actors involved.
You mentioned the sport events, somebody once told me that FIFA is the closest to how Ian Fleming described it, Spectre in James Bond books. So, so I think it somehow stands, I would say. But I want to also ask about the U.S. How much does Donald Trump's America fit into your book? Is Trump's rule also part of authoritarian resurgence, even authoritarian snapback?
Yeah, it's a great question. And of course, we were correcting the galley proofs of the book as the 2024 election was being conducted. And so we tried to make some strategic insertions and predictions based on a hunch that exactly that Donald Trump was going to accelerate these processes. I think we have a couple of comments. One is Trump did not cause what we're saying here, right? But certainly, and we have another piece now in a paper for the British Academy, he's pouring gasoline on the fire in terms of diminishing the influence of liberal democratic norms globally, the U.S.'s commitment to upholding those, even the collapse in U.S. aid, which, yes, was important in public health and humanitarian war, but also supported a lot of independent media around the world. So certainly the lack of commitment to those values in foreign policy is one. But now you see domestically in all of the issue areas that Alex and I looked at, Trump is copying the authoritarian playbook. He's targeting universities. He is engaging in intimidation and lawsuits against media outlets that criticize him, that he doesn't like. He's trying to intimidate to more favorable coverage. And he's also declared himself the sort of overseer of two great global sporting events, the World Cup in 2026 and the Olympic Games in 2028. I actually want to come back to your FIFA observation because Trump and Infantino seem to be getting along quite well. And I think, Infantino is perfectly fine to side with whatever the prevailing norms and values of a host is. We saw that in Qatar when he openly backed the Qatari decision to stand firm against a campaign that was promoting LGBTQ rights by European teams. But I think even beyond that, you see Infantino agreeing that these games should be depoliticized. I think Infantino would side with Trump if there was ever an attempt for boycott on the basis of what Israel is doing in Gaza, the Israeli team. I think there Trump would come down on it hard. So yes, Trump has accelerated all of this. The other part of this, I think, perhaps not as obvious to your readers or viewers, is the United States has an extraordinary extraterritorial infrastructure, right, of laws, rules, regulations, sanctions that were designed to uphold liberal values, right? So, for instance, the Global Magnitsky Act designate violators of human rights who are engaged in corruption, and those individuals can be sanctioned with travel bans and asset freezes. Well, we've seen the Trump administration use Global Magnitsky to go after a Brazilian judge who had oversaw the trial of Bolsonaro, former Brazilian right-wing president, for mounting essentially a coup or refusing to agree to a peaceful transfer of power. And because he's a great political ally of Trump, it seems like he was designated for criticism using this liberal tool. as well as we also see certain parts of the Trump administration supporting the AfD, or what they consider to be transnational right political parties and movements that seem to be against the sort of transatlantic architecture, but for Musk and allies are more aligned with what they view as their kind of social and political agenda. So you see it really on two sides, the U.S. withdrawing from commitment to the traditional promotion and support of these liberal institutions and values, and now the repurposing of the apparatus to support transnational movements that are more aligned with this kind of more right-wing illiberalism that defines the Trump administration.
Yeah, I agree with all of that, of course. The thing I would add, looking forward, we're very accustomed as political scientists to think about collapsing of authoritarianism and changes in types of government. And now I think what you're seeing is scholars having to wrestle with what's happening in the United States. And can we rely on the United States being a liberal democracy going forward? Chances are, yes. I mean, I think hopefully the institutions hold, and this is a passing phase. It's not exactly the first difficult or illiberal phase of governance that the United States has ever been through in its very long history. But I think you have the real possibility of this current administration and current movement trying to manipulate the rules, tilt the rules so that Trump could run for a third term, an unconstitutional third term, for example. That would rely on the U.S. Republican Party and the Supreme Court stopping it. Would they? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know, right? So there are all these questions now about the democratic credentials really at the core of the United States that if they were to go in a particular direction would signal, I think, very dark times for global democracy, global liberal democracy. I mean, you would effectively be leaving, Europe, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and a few others. Are they really in a position to sustain and promote global democracy and liberal democracy? I think that's going to be very difficult. I mean, they have their own issues as well. So that's speculation. But
So to wrap it up and talking about dark times, I don't want to make out of this one big planetary battle. But if the authoritarians want to dictate the agenda and liberal democracies will at least partly resist, can it also lead to conflicts, to wars?
Well, hopefully not. What I think you are seeing is a conflict of ideas and contestation at all levels of governance now. I think one of the messages we have in the book and one of the observations is that the international realm for a long time used to promote liberal values in terms of they were embedded in UN missions and certain regional organizations, international treaties, the norm of allowing journalists access to one another's sort of polities. And what you see now is that this is really no longer the case. And the kind of contestation that we've seen nationally, the populist movements, alt-right movements about what is the West? What is freedom of expression? What are these values? What is the purpose of a university, right? That these domestic contests are now being scaled up to the regional level, to the global level. Alliances are being formed transnationally. There is no such thing anymore as the separation between foreign policy, international politics, and domestic politics. And so it's a much more competitive, much more contested in terms of ideas and ideology and norms and values in multi-levels than it was before. Whether it leads to conflict, I hope not. But I think the separation of spheres that we had grown accustomed to as sort of analysts and as academics, I think is no longer the case. That would be my takeaway.
yeah, I think the contestation point is very important and very interesting. I'll just take a thought experiment. The current flashpoint, I think, that's security relevant with regard to democracy versus authoritarianism is Taiwan and China. And of course, there are sovereignty and territorial and historical issues involved as well. But at its root, you have Taiwan, which is overwhelmingly does not want to be ruled by mainland China, and mainland China, which overwhelmingly wants to rule Taiwan. And so you have an inherent tension there. To me, the interesting question about contestation and liberal values and all the institutions that we talk about in the book is, hypothetically, what if Beijing invaded Taiwan tomorrow? what would the response be? Not in the security realm, I mean, that's a different set of questions, but in the realm that we're talking about of sports leagues and universities and media and liberal soft power entities and networks, what would that be? What would that look like given China's points of economic leverage around the globe, given confusion among diplomats about what the one China policy even means? Would you be confident in a concerted, coordinated, liberal democratic pushback against that? I think a few decades ago, you might have been very confident. Today, I'm not so sure.
This was another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. Subscribe, listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and on the other platforms. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Ko-fi. For the link, see also a description of this episode. Thank you for listening and stay tuned.